So this is chapter 24, our introduction to trauma. So for people that are younger than 44 years old, traumatic injuries are the leading cause of death in the United States. What we can do as pre-hospital care providers is that we can actually reduce suffering, long-term disability, and sometimes death from trauma-related injuries. Trauma is basically physical forces applied to the body in one way or another that end up causing injury underneath. Medical is like those illnesses not caused by an outside force. So trauma, outside force. Traumatic injuries may be caused by underlying medical conditions, or a medical illness may result from recent traumatic injuries, but they kind of have their own lane to stay in, so to speak. Evaluation of your mechanism of injury will provide you with your index of suspicion for different types of serious or life-threatening injuries. So your index of suspicion is your awareness and concern for potentially serious underlying and unseen injuries. So kind of that gut feeling put into words. So traumatic injuries occur when the body's tissues are exposed to energy levels beyond their normal tolerance. Your mechanism of injury is how that actually is caused. There are several different concepts of energy that are associated with injury. You have potential energy, kinetic energy, and energy of work. Keep in mind that energy can't be created or destroyed. It can only be converted. So once you have energy, it has to either transfer to something or it has to convert, typically into heat. Work is defined as a force acting over a distance. So forces that bend, pull, compress tissues beyond their inherent limits result in the work that actually causes your injury. We're talking about kinetic energy. That's the energy of a moving object. To calculate kinetic energy, it's half of the mass times velocity squared. So when you double the weight, or if you double the speed, you're going to cause different chances for energy. So that's why a big truck causes more than a small car. However, if you have the small car going twice as fast as the large truck, they start to balance out a little bit. Potential energy is associated with the product of mass, force of gravity, and the height. This is mostly associated with energy of objects that are falling. Mechanism of injury profiles. Different mechanisms produce many different types of injuries. You have non-significant MOIs, which pretty much cause injury to a specific isolated body part or a fall without a loss of consciousness. Not really something that we're going to worry about. Significant MOIs, this is a multi-system trauma or injury to more than one body system, falls from heights, motor vehicle and motorcycle crashes, car versus pedestrian or versus bicycle or motorcycle, gunshot wounds, stabbings, they all have more potential to cause serious underlying injury. Blunt and penetrating trauma, these are the two main categories for traumatic injuries. Blunt trauma is a force to the body that causes injury without actually penetrating through the skin. Then penetrating is where objects cause injury by piercing, penetrating the skin, and then it can damage soft tissues, internal organs, body cavities, etc. underneath of all of that. And either type can occur from a variety of MOIs. You can have both at the same time. So it's important to assess not only for visually significant injuries, something you can see, but also looking deeper to make sure that you're not missing underlying. Blunt trauma, this is when an object actually makes contact with the body or body makes contact with something else. We're going to look for skin discoloration and pain because those might be the only signs of blunt trauma. There might not be significant external bleeding for us to be able to see. So we have to maintain a high index of suspicion for hidden injuries. Vehicle crashes, when a motor vehicle crashes, there are several different collisions that take place. And crashes can be classified several different ways. So it can be a frontal or head-on, rear end, a lateral, which we call a T-bone, rollovers, or rotations. The principal difference is the direction of the force of impact. But when a crash occurs, there's typically 3 collisions. So the car against an object, typically another car or a tree. The damage to the car itself does not directly affect your patient care, but provides information about the severity. By assessing the vehicle, you can often determine more about the mechanism of injury. Then you've got the passenger against the interior of the car. So kinetic energy produced by the patient's mass and velocity is converted into the work of stopping his or her body. Common passenger injuries are lower extremity fractures, rib fractures, head trauma, depends on if they're restrained or unrestrained. And the final is the internal organs against the solid structures of the body. So internal may occur because your brain smashes into the inside of your skull, your organs smash into your rib cage, etc. And those tend not to be as obvious. If the head hits the windshield, you can see that. You can see the injury on the outside of the body. Generally, it's going to be a bruise, it's going to be a scratch, something along those lines. But you can see the 2 purple areas. So the brain's going to contact in the front first, and then it'll actually bounce back and contact in the back. So it's called coup counter coup. So there's actually a lot more injury to the brain itself, more so than what you can see. Significant MOIs are suggested by death of another occupant in the vehicle, severe deformity of the vehicle, or intrusion into the patient compartment. A lot of today's vehicles are meant to kind of fall apart to take the brunt of that energy transfer so it's not sent into the patient compartment. Moderate intrusion from a lateral accident, severe damage from the rear, crashes in which rotation is involved. Rotation is definitely the more dangerous version of a crash where the vehicle stays on its wheels. And then anybody that's ejected. For frontal crashes, you want to evaluate if a restraint system was used. Hopefully their seatbelt was positioned properly in the 3-point method. So it should go over their chest, attach at that hip, and then go over the hips, the low portion of the hips. If they don't have that on appropriately, oftentimes I see people that put the strap underneath their arm or completely behind them. That completely changes your MOI and what you could potentially be seeing as underlying injuries. And then you want to determine if the airbags have gone off. Seatbelts, airbags, they help prevent that second collision inside the motor vehicle. So they try and prevent the body from hitting something else. They decrease the severity of deceleration, decrease injury to the chest, face, and head. However, you can still get injuries to your extremities and then those internal organs, because remember, those internal organs are that third crash. If the airbag didn't inflate during the accident, that creates a problem, a safety hazard for us as EMS professionals, because when we're extricating that patient, it could end up going off. And so we often try to put on a steering wheel harness to keep that from happening. Or if it does go off, it's not going to completely knock us out. Remember that supplemental restraint systems are meant to be used in a specific way. And if they're not used that way, then it can end up causing further injury. So if you have your seatbelts too low, it can cause hip dislocations. If you have the belt too high, it can cause internal injuries, especially across that lower abdomen. Lumbar spine fractures are also possible. They're very likely in kids and older adults if all they have on is that lap belt. It's not very often anymore that you have somebody that has the torso belt without a lap belt. When I was a kid, a lot of places or a lot of people sold electric seat belts. So the torso part went up with the door after you closed it, and then you had to put the lap belt across. They don't do that anymore because a lot of people were hanging themselves in a relatively minor crash. So you shouldn't have to worry about that anymore. Passengers that are riding in vehicles equipped with airbags but not wearing seatbelts are often thrown forward, and they come into very hard contact with the airbag and or the doors. So look for any contact points between the patient and the vehicle. For rear end collisions, these are known to cause whiplash type injuries, especially if the headrest is not properly positioned. As the body is propelled forward as a unit, the head and neck end up being left behind with that energy, and so it snaps back. The cervical spine surrounding area may be injured. More often than not, it's just going to be a muscular type thing, but it's not always. It still has the potential. And then you can still get an acceleration type injury of the brain, because the third collision of the brain and the skull, there's not a lot of room in there. So when it hits one side of the skull, it typically bounces and hits the other side with any sort of force that's applied. Lateral crashes are very commonly associated with death. The vehicle being struck from the side is usually above its center of gravity, and so it begins to rock away from the side of impact, and then the patient inside ends up sustaining a lateral whiplash injury, which can oftentimes cause tearing or shearing forces on those blood vessels up in the neck. And then aside from the force, if you have significant intrusion into the patient compartment, you can get lateral chest and abdominal injuries on that side of impact, possible fractures of lower extremities, pelvis, ribs, and then organ damage from that third collision, depending on how strong it was. So approximately 25% of all severe injuries to the aorta that occur in an MVC are the result of a lateral collision. So the chance of rupturing or injuring your aorta is actually pretty high in those lateral crashes. We'll go ahead and continue on in the next one.